Blessings, good evening. It's Tuesday night, so we have some questions have come in. First question tonight. Even Nibana is subject to cause and effect. Is that correct? Well, strictly speaking, Nibana is not subject to anything, because Nibana is the unconditioned, the unborn, the uncreated. It's that which is the deathless, it's no longer subject to birth and death, beginning and end, arising and ceasing. So you could say it's no longer subject to cause and effect. We just chanted the Noble Eightfold Path, so on a few occasions the Buddha said that any teaching, the way they talked about teaching in the time of the Buddha, they called it the Dhamma and the discipline. Any teaching that doesn't have or doesn't contain the Noble Eightfold Path will not be able to lead someone to Nibana, the unborn, the uncreated. But as long as people are practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, cultivating that, then there will be what we call the four samanas, four kinds of samana will arise in the world. Sotapanna, Sakadagami, Anagami, Arahant. What we call noble ones, people who have had deep insight into the impermanent nature of body and mind, the five khandhas, and successively let go of various mental defilements, attachment to the body, self-view, skeptical doubt, blind attachment to rituals and practices. Those are the first three fetters that the stream enterer, the Sotapanna, has abandoned. And on they go, abandoning different fetters until they reached Nibana. So Nibana, you could say, is the result of practicing or cultivating, perfecting the Noble Eightfold Path. But Nibana itself is beyond cause and effect. So we also compare Nibana to like the far shore. So you're crossing the lake or the ocean. You need a raft or a boat to cross the ocean. And that raft is compared to the Dhamma, or the Dhamma of the Noble Eightfold Path. So you need the Noble Eightfold Path, you need to cultivate it, you need to create the causes for purifying your mind from defilement, wrong views, from ignorance, avijja, through the practice. And the practice is like paddling this raft across the ocean to the other side. When you get to the other side, then you can leave the raft. You don't need to carry it with you once you go onto the shore. You can leave it behind. Nibana is like that. You no longer need the Noble Eightfold Path, the practice of sila, samadhi, panya, once Nibana has been reached. So the one who's reached Nibana, we call it Arahant, they no longer make karma. They don't need to. There's no more sense of self, no more attachment to body and mind as self, so there's no one making karma. You might say, colloquially, there's no one home. But until that point, the karma that the practitioner is making is for Nibana, it's for the end of suffering. So the path is the cause, magga, phala is the fruit, the result. But once Nibbana has been achieved, that's it. They don't need to develop the path anymore. They can set that aside. Doesn't mean to say an arahant would stop meditating or following the rules of discipline of a monk. They would still do that, as the Buddha himself did, and he encouraged all monks, including arahants, to continue practicing, keeping the rules of discipline, practicing meditation. Because even an arahant will dwell in emptiness, states of samadhi, as a kind of recreation. Next question. Dear Lumpur, is it correct to say that a person who no longer has self-view has only right view? Well, if you're referring to Sakkaya Ditthi, as I just mentioned, this self-view, this view that the five khandhas, body and mind, are a self, or within a self, or part of a self, the different views you can have relating to this body and mind, seeing it as a self. If you mean self-view, you mean that Sakkaya Ditthi. Well, true, to abandon self-view, that attachment, you need to be developing right view on the highest level, not just sort of believing in the Buddha and the Dhamma, the Sangha and the teachings, but also seeing the Four Noble Truths in the moment, in your experience, seeing defilements arising and abandoning them, knowing them as impermanent, not self. But somebody may have abandoned self-view, say a Sotapanna, stream enterer, but they still have some ignorance left, some craving and attachment left in their mind. The conditioning process is still going on. They've weakened many defilements and abandoned some completely, but they still have some left. Still have subtle forms of lust and greed, anger, subtle attachments to conceit, restlessness of mind, attachment to the bliss and the factors of jhana. And ultimately they have still attachment to avijja. There's still clouds of avijja. There's ignorance clouding the mind, covering over the mind. So their right view is not going to be perfect in the sense that there's still some mental defilements, greed, anger and delusion, even though they're pretty subtle, but they may still slip into their experience, but they would recognize them very quickly. Once self-view is gone, then the mind is able to put aside hindrances and things that previously it would attach to and identify with as self, can set aside all of that very easily and quickly. The practice of vipassana, the development of insight of the Noble One is well developed. So they're constantly refining their right view, you might say, until it's perfected. The arahant, they have right view. They see everything as Dhamma. No longer any delusion or ignorance, no longer any attachment. But even a Sotapanna or Sakadagami, once returner, or even an Anagami, non-returner, has some subtle defilements which will affect their view. And they may not yet see some defilements as defilements yet. They can still have mental blocks or blind spots, but they're very subtle. They're not the sort of blind spots that would lead them to break the precepts or hurt others, hurt themselves, or lead into endless rebirth in the normal way. So the perfection of right view is seeing everything as Dhamma, perfecting insight into the Four Noble Truths, knowing the nature of suffering, its origin, having abandoned the origin of suffering, knowing the cessation of suffering, having realized that, and knowing the path that leads to the cessation of suffering and having cultivated that. So only the arahant will have done that. Dear Luang Por, I was wondering, when I take the 8 precepts, am I allowed to, 1, play my regular sport, such as playing badminton with the same gender players? I think the important thing is that you're still playing sport, you're probably still enjoying that, the recreation, the enjoyment of sport, which could be a basis for loss of mindfulness, attaching to certain moods, pleasures. Whether you play with the same gender or the opposite gender, there's going to be these kinds of attachments stimulated. That's why we do play sport. It's interesting, it's absorbing, pleasurable, and it feeds a lot of emotion. Success, failure, win, loss. Get excited, get annoyed. We kind of like that. Funny, isn't it? People play sport and they somehow weirdly enjoy losing because they indulge in the feeling of loss, and then they try harder next time to win again, maybe. And as you know, I'm from the UK. Where I was brought up, their religion was soccer, what I call football. In Melbourne, probably the religion for many people is Australian rules football. But I know in the UK, some people's obsession with football, soccer, is so extreme that they even buy a plot of land next to their favourite club so that they can be buried there. So it really is on the level of a religion. And people, their mood goes up and down according to the success and failure of their team. So the same dynamics are at work when you play sport yourself. You may not be professional, but you play for a reason, don't you? To distract yourself. There are benefits from sport, of course. Exercise can contribute to good health. It's a social thing. Make friends, but then you also make enemies, don't you? Sometimes you don't like the other team. So it can be a cause for worldly, coarse emotions and the attachment to them. So say in a monastic community, you don't play sport. We can exercise doing useful things like sweeping leaves, chopping wood, carrying things from here to there. We do certain activities which you might call exercise. And you can exercise, do yoga and certain physical exercises if you need to, particularly for ailments, illnesses and so on. But we don't play sport as such. So anyone keeping the 8 precepts, whether at home or in a monastery, should be avoiding sport. Do exercises on my own without music, like yoga, Pilates or Qigong. I guess you're asking, are they okay? Yeah, well, you're correct. A lot of these things nowadays, people will listen to their music as they do different exercises. And the music, it's not evil listening to music, but it's tends to become an attachment, doesn't it? You attach to the pleasure, the sense pleasure, gives you a mood. And in a certain way, it can be helpful when you're stressed to listen to music to calm down. But in terms of it refining your awareness, developing states of samadhi, developing insight, you have to learn how to go beyond the attachment to music. Many meditators and practitioners have had to learn this. Many of us, before we are monks or nuns, we like to listen to music, play music. I'm the same. So when you start meditating, certainly when you come into a monastery, part of your conditioning that you're dealing with is memory of old songs, tunes, and so on. And it will come up in your memory as you meditate. So you have to learn to be very patient with that. And if you stop listening to music, say if you're keeping 8 precepts, or you become a monk or a nun, well then you'll gradually be able to let go of that attachment because you're not feeding it anymore. And it's not, as I said, it's not that you're seeing music as evil, but you're seeing the limitation of music. It can still cause an attachment, be a distraction. So if you do exercises like yoga, qigong, and many monastics do, and people keep the 8 precepts do, fine, that's fine as a way to practice mindfulness with the movements of the body and those exercises, that's fine. But yes, try to not listen to music. I feel nervous about the future. Can you give me any suggestions how to deal with this, please? The future is unknown. Anagata Dhamma. Anagata means future. Future is unknown. We can guess, we can predict, we can go to the astrologer. But if we're perfectly honest and discern, reflect on this, we don't really know what the future holds. So if you're listening to this, we just had a power cut, so you probably lost us for a while. We're back now. The question was, I feel nervous about the future. Can you give me any suggestions how to deal with this, please? So I was just pointing out the future is unknown, and we don't like it, do we? When we don't know something, that's part of the cause of this nervousness. You don't know. And often where you don't know something, your mind will fill in with imagination, it'll guess, predict, and quite often we are guessing the worst will happen. This only makes us feel more uncomfortable. So perhaps the first thing is just to become more aware of what's going on in your mind, and when this fear or nervousness about the future comes up, maybe try to investigate it. Ask yourself, what's going on here? So, say you're nervous about a particular thing, the event or part of your life that you know is coming along. Ask yourself, well, what does this nervousness or this fear involve? So there'll be a feeling, maybe a physical feeling if it's very strong, or at least a mental kind of discomfort. There'll be certain perceptions associated with this nervousness and fear about the future. So I was just saying, you might have a vision of the worst thing that might happen before it's happened. You see the worst, you paint a picture in your mind of something bad happening, so that will obviously make you feel uncomfortable, nervous. Or maybe, when you have something coming up that will have consequences for you, like you have to go to the doctor to get tests done on your health, or you're going for a job interview, or you're going on a date, or you have to take an exam. Things that seem to have a consequence, or will possibly have a big consequence for you, obviously will bring up more concern. And often we sort of say, what if this happens? What if that happens? Of course, nothing has happened yet. It's all in your imagination. Your mind fills in this hole, and then it's accompanied by unpleasant feelings, because if you are filling in a picture of something bad happening, well, you're not going to feel very comfortable physically or mentally. So as you pay attention and practice awareness, mindfulness, you might start to notice all this. Sometimes you even get to the point where you can laugh at yourself and say, oh, look at me making myself unhappy about something that hasn't even happened yet. But the mindfulness, paying attention back to body and mind in the present moment, will help you to see more clearly what's going on. And perhaps you can change things. You can teach yourself not to think in that way, or not to make it so serious, or give so much importance to thoughts about the future when it hasn't happened yet. Another part of it, you may seek out information or just reflect on it, and maybe seek out some information from other people, other sources that help you deal with this upcoming problem, issue, thing that maybe is bringing you nervousness about the future. So, often you think the worst about something, you're thinking about the worst possible outcome. We'll get some information, maybe you realize, it's more likely that there'll be a successful outcome, or there's less danger than you think, there's less of a problem than you're predicting or seeing in your mind. Obvious one is like going on an aeroplane. Some people are nervous about flying, but actually flying is relatively safe compared to driving a car or doing other activities. So you get some information and you think it through, that may help to allay some of those fears. So you're using wisdom. Or sometimes you just accept you don't know something and you can't know, so you accept that. You just say, I don't know, I'll have to live with this not knowing. Because if you think about it, you don't know anything about the future. You can only guess based on what's gone before. Even like people would come to Ajahn Chah and say, I don't believe in future lives, rebirth, and that there'll be a life after death. And he wasn't too bothered by that. That's their choice, and they're just expressing what they feel. But sometimes he'd answer them, he'd say, do you think there'll be a tomorrow? Do you think there'll be a tomorrow? And they'd nearly always say, yeah, of course there's going to be a tomorrow. There's always going to be a tomorrow. Well, you don't know that for sure, do you? Because tomorrow hasn't happened either, but we just take it for granted. So sometimes you can reflect on what's gone before to help you understand what might and how to approach what's going to come up with more mindfulness and wisdom. Try and get a reasonable attitude. It's not that the Buddha said we shouldn't make preparations for possible problems in our life or dangers, health problems or other kind of problems that may come up. But you also have to do it with a skillful attitude, so you're not creating suffering out of this not knowing or this fear of what might happen. You can make yourself very miserable, especially when it becomes a habit. You make yourself miserable and nothing's happened yet, and quite often, if we're honest, nothing does happen, or nothing untoward, nothing bad does happen. But we've already been worrying and thinking about it, so we've made ourselves very unhappy or stressed. And sometimes we even do things that hurt or harm ourselves, harm others, because of our fears. So try to reflect on this and see where you may actually be making things worse than they need to be, or creating suffering out of nothing, or making the suffering worse than it needs to be. And mindfulness will help, and then some wise reflection. And if you have a Dhamma teacher, that can always help. So people would go, say, to Ajahn Chah with fears about their health. That'd be an obvious one. They've got some news that they have some health condition. What am I going to do? What if I die? And, Ajahn Chah would often bring them down to earth with a very down-to-earth, ordinary kind of answer, such as, we all have to die. Or, well, you either will recover or you'll die. There's only two options here. And they thought, because we tend to get caught up in the emotion, don't you? When you're nervous, you're afraid. It's the emotion that takes over, and you don't think straight. So someone who's more balanced, calm, wise will help cut through that. Everybody gets ill. Everybody must die one day. Everything is uncertain. You don't know if you'll get the job if you go for the interview. You don't know whether you'll pass the exam. All you can do is focus on preparing yourself for whatever this test or challenge that life is bringing you. And that's more useful to you. If you've got an exam coming up, would do your reading and your preparation rather than sitting there worrying or being nervous. You have to introduce that to your thinking. Teach yourself not to go the way of fear and nervousness, because that doesn't help. Go back to doing your preparation, doing the right thing for that particular test or challenge that's coming up. So Dhamma practice really helps. Learning to meditate will help because you have more self-control, more mindfulness, and maybe you can see some of your habits of mind and see where you're creating suffering out of nothing. When we are caught into fear, nervousness, what do? We tend to do unskillful things. We become more flustered, maybe become aggressive sometimes because of the fear. So when you establish mindfulness, maybe you can introduce more skillful qualities. An obvious one, say people who are afraid of ghosts. You know, oh, what if there's a ghost? Well, if you meet a ghost and you're mindful, maybe you just share merits with it or wish it well, and then your fear it may come up, but it doesn't lead on to you doing something unskillful. Or if you go to a job interview, well, again, spread metta to the people who are interviewing you, spread metta to yourself, calm yourself down, try to think in a more positive way, spreading thoughts of goodwill, kindness to yourself, to others. That would be a good preparation, rather than going to fear and aversion. So once you've established mindfulness, you can introduce Dhamma, a better Dhamma than maybe what you're experiencing, a better way of thinking, more skillful reflections, and this will help you deal with your nervousness. If you've seen it before as well, if you've been nervous, afraid before, we can see, well, it arose, it passed away before. It's not there all the time. You can use that reflection as well. And you say, oh, this will pass. So maybe you feel very uncomfortable in a situation, but it will pass. You know it will pass because it's arisen and passed away before. It arose, it ceased. It began, it ended before. So it's going to begin and end again. It's not going to be there all the time. So you can almost like establish that understanding and say, oh, I'll wait for this to pass. It's just a feeling. It's just a thought. And meditation will help you do that. Another question. When we do good or show kindness, we often feel a sense of satisfaction, which encourages us to continue doing good. In a way, this creates a desire to keep performing good actions. However, in this teaching, it seems that we are not encouraged to rely on this feeling as motivation. Could you please elaborate on what you mean by being lost in or attached to goodness? Now, this is something that some of our teachers point out. Someone like Ajahn Kalyano, who's always teaching from the highest place in the practice, someone who's completed the Noble Eightfold Path, we say, someone who's reached Nibana, maybe a very wise, enlightened person. Someone at the very highest level is able to point out the dangers, the obstacles at every level of the practice. So, in the beginning of the practice, maybe our aim is simply just to do a bit more good in our life for ourselves and others and give up some of our bad habits, be a bit more disciplined, a bit kinder, a bit more generous. Maybe you're working with fairly coarse mental defilements and that come out in our speech and our behaviour. And on that level, maybe you don't need to think too much about attaching to goodness. The more good you do, the better for you. The more generosity you practice, the more kindness you practice, the more restraint of some of your worst habits and emotions, the better. Maybe that's the appropriate attitude in the beginning, because you're learning, you're new to the practice. But then as you practice more, and especially if you learn meditation, keep precepts regularly, practice the Dhamma more and more, your mind starts to know more, to be more experienced, be more refined. Then it's possible that some of the happiness you're generating can become, like you say, it's quite satisfying, can lead to a sense of satisfaction, contentment. And there could be a hidden danger with that. It can lead to complacency. It can also lead to a subtle sense of self. You might call it the good self. I am someone who has done good, I am doing good, I am a good person. So it can still be self-view. You might say it's not the worst kind of attachment because it's better than being a bad person who causes a lot of trouble for themselves or for others, causes a lot of suffering. Better to be attached to being a good person at first, but it's still an attachment, and the Buddhist path is teaching us to abandon all forms of attachment. So sooner or later we've got to seek out where we may still have attachment. So anyone who meditates knows that sometimes we get very blissful and peaceful in our meditation and we attach to that. We like it, we want more of it, we want to hold on to it, but it fades. Maybe the peace of your meditation fades and then you feel a longing wanting to get it back. That's the suffering of that kind of attachment. Or you have this sense of conceit arise. I can meditate, I am peaceful, I am good at meditation, which is still an attachment. And that can be on every level. You practice generosity, I am generous. I am kind. You have kindness, compassion. I am compassionate. So these subtle forms of self-view form around even the good that we do. So we have to continue to reflect on the impermanent nature of those thoughts, that sense of self, the feelings of contentment, satisfaction. They in themselves, they don't last. They're still conditions of mind that arise and cease. It's not that we shouldn't experience them, but when we experience them, we should know that they're impermanent. And what's impermanent is subject to change, to degeneration. It's suffering in the sense that if you cling to those feelings, you'll suffer because they can't last. And ultimately, they're not self. There's not a self. You're not trying to create a new, improved, better self. That's the goal of your practice. You're trying to purify the mind from all wrong views and attachments that cause suffering. So any form of self-view that forms around feelings, pleasurable feelings, feelings of satisfaction, ideas and thoughts about self, the conceit of self, even though it's coming from the good that you do, you still have to investigate and reflect, this is a condition of mind that ultimately is not a self. As I said, it doesn't mean to say you should just give up the practice, because everything is, can become an attachment. But as you are practicing, you have to keep reflecting. And this will help you not to suffer, because even meditators and people who practice Buddhism can suffer from their practice because they don't realize how they're forming a sense of self around the good things they do. You can help someone and feel very good about it, and it is a good thing to help someone. But that attachment is a subtle thing, so it tends to be more of a personal reflection, doesn't it? If you're attaching to a feeling of satisfaction, you feel good about what you've done, what's happened. On one level, it is good, and that maybe it's to be encouraged, do more of that. But on the deeper level and on the personal level where you might reflect is, but I shouldn't attach to this, because if I attach, there'll be some suffering when things change, or if next time around I'm not as good as before, I don't get such a good outcome as before, because life is uncertain. Things, You help someone today, maybe tomorrow you can't help anyone, or you can't successfully help anyone. Things change, things are unpredictable, things are uncertain. So you introduce that reflection to help guard against you forming some kind of wrong view or clinging to a sense of self based on the good that you're doing. But it doesn't mean to say don't do any good. So it's a subtle point that we often don't see at first until we bump into something or have make a mistake, and maybe you've helped someone, or you've done your meditation, or you're keeping the precepts, and you're feeling good about this, and then something happens that points out to you that your sense of self has formed and now it's being stirred up. So it could be criticism from someone. Maybe you help someone or a group of people many times, and then someone comes along and says, you don't do anything good, you're not good. They criticize you maybe unjustly or unreasonably, or tell lies, whatever. Does that cause you suffering? Or maybe just with changes, like you get older, maybe you get sicker. And as you get older and sicker, most people generally get older and sicker in their life, maybe you can't do as much as you used to be able to do. So maybe you feel disappointed. Oh, I'm reaching the end of my life. I can't help anyone like I used to. Maybe you feel useless. It's quite a common problem for people, as they get a little weaker, more fragile, as they get old. They feel kind of useless and just a burden on others, nothing good. Which is, I would say, probably not true. They probably have many things to offer. It's just they have to adapt to their aging body and different situation. But they often don't see it. So they're stuck in feelings of feeling useless or a burden, or feeling guilty, and so on. Guilt is another one. Maybe you do good, but sometimes you still make mistakes and do things that are not so good. And that takes away from the good that you've done. On and on it goes. So we have to keep establishing mindfulness and reflecting even on the good we do. Sometimes it's impermanent. Can't be perfect and do good all the time, 24 hours a day. Who can? An arahant can, but no one else can. So sometimes we have to accept we still have attachments, defilements, we're not perfect, we have our faults, our weaknesses, just as other people do, and we try to tolerate them. Well, we have to tolerate ourselves as well. So this is why the Buddha said the development of insight into impermanent suffering, not self, the three characteristics, is the best kind of karma, because it releases your mind from all attachments, all wrong views, all clinging, even to the sense of self based around doing good. So, it's quite an important reflection, this one. Can always talk about it again another time, but maybe for tonight I'll leave it there and wish you all well in your Dhamma practice.